Hi everyone, Ben Newton from Macro Connect here. In today's video, we're going to be covering how to successfully code live loops in Sonic Pi. Now this video is designed to go in tandem with the Code to Compose student-facing workbook, lesson number 4, starting on page 14. So if you're not there yet, watch some of the videos earlier in the series, but if you and your students are on lesson number 4, this is a great place to familiarize yourself with the concepts before you get in front of your students and start coding. So by the end of this video, you're going to be a master at live loops. You're going to understand fully how to create them, how to use multiple live loops in one composition, and essentially be prepared to answer any questions that you may encounter that your students have as they're going through this lesson. So let's jump right into it. A live loop, as you may have guessed by the name, it's essentially a loop that we can manipulate on the fly, thus the word live. So for purposes of this lesson, just pay attention to this as being a loop. So a loop is something that repeats forever until we instruct our program that we want it to stop. So up until this point, play commands and sample commands are things that we've had to instruct on our own, how long we've wanted to play and when we wanted them to stop, how long we wanted their sleep durations to be in between them, etc. That is a very powerful tool in and of itself. However, you'll find you'll end up having to write lots of different lines of code and sync things up in a way that will just become very, very aggravating, and it'll give you a headache once you get into 100, 200, and 300 lines of code in a composition, especially when you're just trying to repeat a simple concept or a melody or a beat over and over again. Enter the live loop. Live loops are very simple. Before I over-explain them, I'm just going to show you how to write them. Start by writing the word live underscore loop. All live loops need a name. Start that with a colon. Now, what do I mean by name? Once you start juggling with a lot of live loops, some may be long, some may be short, some may be just serving one singular purpose, like you want a hi-hat playing 16th notes in your composition. Basically, you would write the word hi-hat here just to identify this live loop on the fly. Like when you're live coding, you can say, okay, here's my hi-hat loop. One of my other live loops is called melody. Okay, this is where I have my melody playing in the background. Whatever it may be, it's used as an identifier. You must note, do not create a live loop with two identical names. Otherwise, it just won't work. Just keep that in mind. If your students are raising their hand and saying, I don't understand this, it's because just check that. Check the line in the debug error message and go to it. Make sure that it's not the same name as another live loop. So we've written live loop, space, colon, named it. Now introducing a new concept here. It's a concept called do and end. We have to write the word do when writing a live loop. So in the simplest way, everything that comes after the word do and before something that we need to end all of our live loops in, which is the word end, everything that comes in between it, as we'll show you in a second, is going to be looped forever. Anytime that you have a command in Sonic Pi that requires a do, you also must code and finish the loop with the word end. This is going to come up for a lot of different commands. This is the first time you're seeing it. So just keep that in mind for this lesson. We're going to get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of it in later lessons, and so will your students. But for today, just know that anytime you write the word do, you also need a corresponding end. So on the first line, live loop, hi-hat, do. So I'm not going to do a hi-hat here, so we'll just write example. That's what we're going to call this loop. Now this is what your students are going to see in the basically the first time they'll ever encounter this. It's something very simple. Play 60 gets thrown around a lot. It's essentially middle C, and sleep 1. Now they've already seen this before in the first and second lessons of Code to Compose. So right now, when you can explain this to them, that right now you are instructing our program to loop the note 60 playing once every second at 60 BPM forever. So when we hit run, you get a nice constant pulsing beat here of just that 60 note playing every second. So this is a live loop in its most rudimentary form. So let's take it a step further here. In the lesson, students are going to be creating their own drum beat. So same with play. You can use sample commands in live loops. It'll work the same. Just refer back to the last lesson if you are confused when I'm starting to do these samples. But when your students are composing their drum beat, they're going to start by having a bass drum. So there's a lot of different options here. We can use the prefix of BD. I'm using the prefix of drum here. Let's try drum bass hard. We just want a nice steady kick. So right now, if I started this, steady kick, it's going to keep going. Let's say we want to have a little backbeat here for those of you who are familiar with some old school rock and roll terminology. We're going to do a backbeat, which is a kick snare, essentially at its core. Let's see, drum. We'll find snare hard. We'll also sleep one. Now we've added essentially there's 4 lines of code that we're looping. Now this is the first time you'll see it. So as you can see, it's just essentially looping through this nonstop. So that is an example of the first live loop that your students are going to encounter here. Now, when you want to do multiple live loops in one composition, it's pretty simple. Follow the same rules. Live loop. Let's call this one hi-hat. Let's change this one and just call this drum beat, one word. Doesn't matter what we call it. It's just for example. Remember, we need the word do when we make a live loop. We press enter, and it comes down here. Now let's do another sample to get a hi-hat. So hi-hat is still using the drum prefix. You look for drum symbol closed. That's essentially a hi-hat. Explain that to your students. Sometimes you may find you have to explain what a hi-hat is. It has a pedal and it's 2 cymbals upside down in a traditional drum kit. But here, let's say we want this to play 16th notes, sleep 0.25. We simply end it again. Now, notice how when I pressed enter here, this end auto formatted and indented back over to the left. That's good. That'll come up later. Just recognize that that's what happens when you're using do's and ends. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. So when we run this program, first it's gonna do this live loop here, and notice there's no sleep in between this end and the next live loop. So basically, both these things are going to start at the same time. So we have something that foreseeably sounds like it could already be a completed beat, but this is the bare bone skeleton for what this lesson is going to be with your students. The next part of the lesson essentially asks your students to now, instead of manipulating samples in a live loop, they need to make the connection that they can also write bass lines or melodies using traditional play with MIDI notation, play 60, play 40, play 52. They can also use play A2 or B4. So it's on them to create their own melody, but essentially it's going to look like this. We'll call this one melody, do. Say play, A2, leave 0.75. Let's do 2 of those. Maybe another note just for color here. Let's do B2, sleeve 0.5, play. Perfect. So right now, notice how I've sort of mixed up the sleeps here just for a, and you can do this if you're doing a demonstration in front of your class, but it doesn't always have to be sleep 1, sleep 0.5. You can mix it up. Try to keep everything a factor of 1, so 0.25, 0.5, 0.125, if you will. But now, all of this is going to loop and start looping at the same time. So we're listening to that, and you can say, okay, something sounds off here. So what I always have my students do is kind of add up in their melody section, add up how much their sleeps come to. So right now, 7.5 and 7.5, we're at 1.5, 2. Okay, that's a nice round number. Oh, 2.5. Maybe that has something to do with why it seems like it's jumping around a little bit. So, 1.52. Now it's going to be 4. So now this is a very traditional, neatly lined up, simple 2-note bass line, playing with a hi-hat and playing with the drum beat in the background. So at this point, your students will have now realized as they're looking at their code that they have coded their first ever drum beat. They're then introduced to a new command that I'll quickly throw in here, but it's called use_BPM. Use_BPM. So BPM stands for beats per minute and means exactly what it says. It's the tempo, it's how fast or how slow SonicPy is going to be processing the code that you write in here. So by default, SonicPy has a BPM of 60, which makes sleep ones pretty useful for explaining, because if there's 60 beats per minute and you have a sleep duration of 1, that is essentially 1 second. But if you want to just show your students a quick way to just speed up or slow down their compositions, you write use underscore BPM before what you want to change the BPM for. So in this course, we pretty much just put it at the beginning of compositions. You can screw around with it later if you want, but let's just say if we use BPM of 100, all of a sudden our song gets a little peppier, it's a little faster. If we use a 40, 20 beats per minute less than the default, it's something that's dragging and slow. And this is a great time to just bring up that, slight, subtle changes in music can totally change the way that the listener perceives it. So just it's a quick bonus command for lesson number 4. So in lesson 4, you and your students know how to use a live loop. The most important thing is structuring it. Cue the live loop, name it something that is different from every other live loop that you're using. Start the command with the word do. Write what you want to be looped, and end it. You can have as many live loops as you want, as long as they have different names. Do and end, very important. And then we have, again, just to review, the use BPM command. If we do use BPM 60, it's going to be no different, because the default BPM in SonicPy is 60. So at this point, you should be equipped to handle everything that comes your way in lesson number 4 in Code to Compose. Happy coding, and I hope you and your students enjoy this lesson.